to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we get going, I want to just give you a heads up. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and that is your invitation to join us. We love questions. We love questions of all types. And please feel free to offer challenging questions that go in a different direction. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's program, The Strength and Curse of Community Organizing. Our guests today are Marshall Ganz, who is a famed community organizer, worked in the civil rights movement during the 1960s, worked with Cesar Chavez during the farm workers organizing in the 1970s, and has worked in election campaigns as well. He's currently a senior fellow at senior lecturer in leadership, organizing, and civil society at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Public Affairs. Also joining us is Damon Shoholm, who is a leader in Twin Cities nonprofit organizing. He is currently the grant-making director for the Bush Fellowship Program at the Bush Foundation. Prior to that, he worked at the Wilder Foundation running its James Shannon Leadership Program and is well known for facilitating the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Collaborative here in the Twin Cities. We're going to start with Marshall, and then we'll bring in Damon in a second. Marshall, you've had this incredible history of accomplishment as a community organizing. I went through it, but the work you did in the 60s, the civil rights movement, the Freedom Summer, working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and based in Mississippi, are remarkable. And then you added it with the work you did with Cesar Chavez and many organizations since. Is it the case that this is a kind of a golden age of community organizing? We've seen Black Lives Matter mobilize millions of people across racial lines to protest violence by police and racial inequalities.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of the term golden age as applied to this. Tom Hayden once said that change is slow except when it's fast. And we are in a fast moment now. And the fluidity, the sort of fragility of so much right now. And so, yeah, there are people responding to it, struggling with it, reacting to it, and trying to deal with it. The question is how that energy can turn into real shifts in power. Today, one of the important distinctions is between mobilizing and organizing. Mobilizing as turning out folks for a rally, an event, organizing as building the structure of leadership, of organization, to be able to make decisions, to be able to develop organized constituencies that then choose mobilizing as different tactics at different times. And the social media has facilitated the ease of mobilization because it reduced the cost radically. But power is built through commitment of people to each other and to building collective capacity. That's the whole idea of organizing, of democracy, is that through collective effort, we are able to accomplish things that we can as individuals that reflect our shared interests, not simply our individual interests. And so I think we're up against some real challenging elements of activity that may not be creating the kind of power shift that is needed.
So that's a kind of kind of a tepid response or a nuanced response to what's happening. But let's just dig deeper. And for folks who may not be as deep as you are in this world, let's put some names on it. So an example of mobilizing might be obviously an election campaign, where you see, and this has been a criticism of the Democratic Party among those in the Latino community. The Democrats show up, before an election and then they disappear. Or MoveOn.org that was very successful in exploiting the social media world to raise a lot of money. But is that the kind of thing you're thinking about mobilizing is insufficient?
In some ways, excuse me, in some ways, maybe the clearest example, El Gonim was here with us for a while, who was the Google guy in Tahrir Square, and who they did a remarkable job of mobilizing, of turning out people that they were able to bring down Mubarak, but they didn't build organization. And as a consequence, the folks with the organization walked away with the goodies, namely the Muslim Brothers in that case, and then ultimately the military. Here, I think electoral campaigns, we were talking a bit earlier, there's been kind of a radical shift in the electoral means of production from organizing to marketing, really. And so a version of marketing door to door is mobilizing. It's just like sending people out, turning people out for stuff. It's like drawing people's resources and refocusing somewhere without actually engaging the people with each other in a relationship of agency, in a relationship of ownership. So it winds up like mobilizing resources as opposed to organizing people, and that's a big distinction.
So when you're talking about organizing, just drawing on your own experience, you're thinking about the work that was done in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, in which folks who had been, the target of vicious racism, African Americans, were brought into a relationship with each other. They stood together. They came to understand themselves as a group, as a collective. Is that what you have in mind?
Well, yes, because the theory of change is based in building a powerful constituency. In other words, that numbers can matter, that people can matter, and that collective effort. So you build a powerful constituency. That's how you begin to shift power. Let's say the Montgomery bus boycott. If it had been won by a lawsuit, the buses might have been desegregated, but power wouldn't have shifted. The fact it was won through a boycott meant that whole community became empowered, individuals in it, the whole community, and it created a power shift to then go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So organizing is about building power and sustained power, not just momentary transactional event. There's a place for both. I don't want to say that, but and I'm thinking about labor organizing has always been like that. A lot of the community organizing builds sustained power, like groups like Isaiah or Lucha or organizations like that. Politics, I don't know, there never really was this golden age, but it was much more dependent on organizing people in a sustained way, whether it was through a political machine or a political party. And then it shifted to where it's now really monetized, and it's all about marketing to individuals. And what you described, people show up for the election, then they're gone. The candidates don't have an interest in sustaining in a sort of an ongoing source of accountability, even if it could be a source of power. I think that's one of the big challenges. I know in the Obama effort, we invested a lot in building that organization, but it was just sort of put on ice after the election. And I think that was a big loss.
You have talked about idealized individual autonomy on the left. And I think that's related to what we're talking about here in terms of organizing, because there's as I read what you've written and listened to, a suspicion about structure.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about structure. Why is that such a hang-up point for the left?
It's a good question, and I think it comes from different directions. The classic in this area was written by Joe Freeman, feminist sociologist, in 1972, and it was called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And what she was writing about was when folks get together to try to do something together, but view structure as problematic. No, we don't need rules. No, we don't need all that. Then what happens is structure gets formed, but informally, not formally. And so then we sit around and say, well, who decided that? And then the factions develop because it's not transparent. It's all off the books. And it becomes paralyzing. You know, structure, I mean, just the word comes from the Latin, you know, construct, to build. Structure is about building something. And when you get right down to it, it's simply the commitments we make to each other about how we're going to work together if we're going to do collective work. And so this resistance to structure is a resistance to building of collective capacity, because structure enables coordination. Now, structures can be imposed upon us, you know, which we don't like because they're coming from the top down. But then we have to be responsible for building our own structures so that we can coordinate, make decisions, strategize, hold one another accountable. And I think, in a way, the sort of elementary piece, the core piece, Albert Hirschman's book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, is such a helpful way of looking at this, that you can deal with system dysfunction through exiting, which is what markets do, or through the exercise of voice in return for loyalty. I join, I become a member, I get voice, but then I need to also respect the decisions that are made through the structures that I've agreed to. Otherwise, and it's that trade-off. And I think people tend to think that I'm giving up my autonomy, when in reality, you're investing an element of your individual agency in the construction of collective agency. And that's how you can build power. So it's not either or, it's both and. And, you know, going back to de Tocqueville, that was his whole argument about how to get beyond narrow self-interest to what he called enlightened self-interest, or self-interest probably understood. It was through the process of association with others and commitment to work with others. And when that piece is not there, we're not learning, we're not developing the affective bonds, and we're not building the power that we need to do. One of my bugaboos, and I'm sure some folks are going to disagree with this, is I think consensus is highly problematic as a decision-making process, because it marginalizes dissent. It marginalizes difference, when difference and dissent is critical for a healthy democratic process. I mean, because it sort of forces things into kind of a groupthink deal. And that's what I mean by my individual autonomy is the most important thing in the world. And so if I don't agree, I can stop the whole thing from happening. I mean, I can understand that in the early days of SNCC, when people were risking their lives together and made those decisions together. Yeah, but if it's going to be engage a lot of people in an ongoing process of learning and change and so forth, one person, I mean, look at Joe Manchin. Is that democratic? Not much, not from my perspective. And it's not that different, actually.
This is very good. I want to bring in Damon Shoholm in a second, but let me just ask you this question, because I think it's related. There is a tremendous emphasis on the importance of the identity of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I'm curious, given the movements you've been part of, whether you see that as in tension with the idea of building coalitions across racial lines, across class lines.
Well, you like easy questions, right? This is like no problem. No, it's clearly, it's one of the major challenges we face right now, is how to function with a shared, how can I say, a shared, I think any commitment to democracy requires a commitment to diversity. And now the question is, is difference then coupled with difference in power as well? And then when difference becomes the basis for stratification, and certainly race has been that in this country since before its founding, there's no founding, Gender has also been significant. Work I do in other parts of the world, religion is pretty powerful divider in India right now with the Modi regime there. Language in Canada was a whole deal between French and English. Now, I'm not equating. I'm just saying that when we work with people other than like us, then we have the work of figuring out what is our common ground. And I think it lies not in sort of abstract ideas, but in our shared humanity. And I think to the extent that we are able to be present to one another as human beings in the most basic ways, but on an equal basis. Because if it's not equal, then it doesn't work. And, it's like inviting, we're going to invite poor folks into the room with the, masters of industry. And we're going to all talk together and we're going to come up with our shared whatever. I mean, it's foolishness because the power outside just reproduces itself inside. And so the prior work is often for communities to build the power they need in order to engage with the rest on an equal or even greater than equal basis. That often requires boundaries that are necessarily exclusive. Because I often use the example Harvey Milk in San Francisco when they build that community, they bound it as a community, which then could develop its own power and its agency to engage with the other powerful institutions. So I think this is part of that struggle because inequality really makes dialogue difficult. I mean, Israel-Palestine's another example. Not going to have dialogue with all that power inequality. And so they're both involved. And it's not a neat process. But I think the only way we get through it is to engage with it. I think withdrawal or dismissal is the opposite because it involves a whole lot of learning, but it also involves figuring out how to balance power. I hope that's responsive. Yeah.
It is. It's a very nuanced, sophisticated answer to a question that was meant to throw you in the deep end.
All right. No, I hope I'm still getting air. Yeah.
You're doing great.
Danielle Allen has a recent book called Difference Without Domination. It's an edited volume. It's really, I think, very helpful in this area.
Damon Shoholm, I want to invite you to join us. Thank you for your patience.
No, I'm deeply enthralled by the conversation anyway, so I'll do my best. Don't throw me in the deep end, Larry, please. Well, somewhere in between.
Well, if you could help us to understand the situation now in the Twin Cities, where there has been a lot of community organizing, there have been a lot of conversations in the community and across our communities about a whole set of issues around racial and economic disparities, around police conduct, and more. And I'm wondering if you could just relate what you've been hearing from Marshall Ganz, what you're seeing. And I would start with the fundamental question, which is, are we looking at kind of this fundamental enduring organizing that Marshall has been referring to, or do you see it as more of a short-term mobilizing around the elections that will be happening on next week?
Yeah, I was really reflecting a lot on that point around mobilizing versus organizing as Marshall was sharing it, trying to sort of discern whether or not I see one or the other more prominently in what we see here in the community, across the community. I actually believe that there has been significant organizing done that appears as mobilizing for us around some of these issues, but I appreciate the point that the structures are still struggling to sort of take hold, right? So we have wonderful organizing efforts through great organizations that do the work that's meant to help create structures that can then take advantage of those mobilizing moments and build power so that they can then continue on past that moment of mobilization. The trick gets to be, I think, that issue around power. So as Marshall states, power is built through a commitment to each other. And I have to be very honest, I think we're faced with this idea that there's not yet that true commitment to each other across our community. And I think if any word has been overused amongst others this last year and a half, it's been reckoning. But it's truly accurate. There is a reckoning that needs to occur for people to examine what their self-interests are versus what the common good is or can be for our community. And I think that we wrestle with that between those that work to mobilize and organize across community and those that hold power in our community. And so there's that dual effort going on of, okay, we're trying to wrestle some power away so that we can start to build more organization that is reflective of the people that need its service, if you will, the most.
So let's make this concrete. In Minneapolis, there's a remarkable set of elections. There's the mayoral election, which of course happens every 4 years. But the remarkable part is the usual control over what gets on the agenda has been punctured by the community organizing you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And this is most striking perhaps in the Ballot initiative to create a new public safety system in Minneapolis. It's been a remarkable campaign just to get it on the ballot, to get wording on the ballot, had to go to the Minnesota Supreme Court. And yet we have polls showing that a majority of Blacks in Minneapolis are not in favor of reducing police. So help me understand, this tension you're talking about regarding power and how it's used. Whose power? I mean, is it community organizing groups who are committed to, this idea and this amendment for a whole lot of reasons versus the people who live in Minneapolis and they see the outcome as threatening to their safety?
Yeah, I think it is about sort of like deconstructing the structures that exist to provide people a semblance of safety and security. But it's a deeper issue around how it is that our systems don't respond, especially to BIPOC communities, in ways that that can make them feel that same sense of security. So there's the divide there. And I think it's interesting, Larry, you bring up, I caught last week, Nikemi Levy-Armstrong and D.A. Bullock were having a conversation, right? And they are both, I think, mobilizers and organizers in our community that have been deeply, deeply invested in seeing systems change and provide better service and access to all communities, but especially communities of color. In Minneapolis, where this has been brought up, they are on different sides of that ballot question, right? And one of the constructs around their disagreement is this idea that the structures and the organization wouldn't be sufficient to serve the needs of the community. I think that is a critical aspect of that question that gets boiled down too often into have police, don't have police. Neither of them is saying either of those things, but that's what the narrative gets boiled down to,
Well, defund the police, that language did not help that nuanced conversation. I want to bring Marshall back in a second. Before I do, Damon, you are one of the real masters of facilitating conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You've done it with many different types of audiences, and I admire that work you do. How would you address the question that Marshall was raising about this effort to incorporate both the differences among individuals and related to power, but also obviously identity, as well as searching for those kind of shared interests, those kind of areas of commonality that might bring people together. How would you assess that in the Twin Cities right now?
Well, it's hard. I'll be careful not to try and assess it across the cities right now, but I will speak from what has felt effective in my work, as you described it, Larry, across a diversity of people people in powerful positions and people in less powerful positions doing this work. And that's helping them embrace the role that identities play in our collective experience. I think people have a tendency to forget some of the identities that they bring into a space, which in the end leads to a better understanding of commonality or common interests. When we're only allowed to share a few aspects of it, our position, maybe, our gender identification, maybe our education, our socioeconomic status, but there's a whole myriad of other identities that come into play. So when you get people to talk about those identities, they find more, and I won't say like things that are the same, but they find that it's easier to build common interests around these bigger issues across community. So that's where I often spend most of my time, is trying to get people to share of themselves first. It's a humanizing way of us connecting and a necessity. And it's a way that is extremely hard to do in today's day and age, even though there are more ways for us to share our lives than there ever have been before. In some ways, we actually don't spend the time to know somebody in the same way.
Marshall, thank you.
Yeah.
Marshall, you've written and practiced a form of community organizing that has emphasized relationships, that those involved in a movement or organizing effort need to come to understand the values and narratives of folks around them. And you've, in a very pithy way, described this as conveying the story of self, us, and now. How is that relevant to the situation we find ourselves right now?
Well, okay, well, the situation. I guess I see the role of narrative as part of a broader picture of how we organize, to create change. And for me, it's grounded in relationship building. It's grounded in the commitments we make to one another around what kinds of values. And I'm thinking of public relationships, not intimate private relationship. I'm thinking of relationships rooted in commitment to common values or a common cause or a common purpose. And then way at the other end is the action that results. But in between, there's sort of what I think of as story, strategy, and structure. Why are we doing what we're doing? That's the narrative piece. Why am I? Why are we? Why do we perceive this current challenge as urgent, something we must respond to? What are our sources of hope, of solidarity, of self-worth, to be able to respond with agency and not react with fear and isolation and self-doubt? To me, that heart work is critical, certainly in movement building, but in many things. I was saying we just finished a session this morning with 26 mayors from different parts, the US and outside, learning public narrative. In other words, learning how to articulate really why they're doing what they're doing by bringing themselves into it. And then trying to bring alive values that are shared, not categories that are shared, but shared experience and values. Now, that's really important. But then, so story is one part. Strategy is the next part, though, because unless it turns into how to turn resources we have into the power we need to get what we want, it's not sufficient. So it's story and strategy, which is the power part, and then structure, which is how we organize ourselves to do what we're trying to do. So it's sort of to get from relationships to action, it seems story, strategy, and structure are sort of the questions we need to address. Often people become so obsessed with strategy, they forget the story part. And if they forget the story part, then the heart isn't being fed. The values aren't being nurtured. The head part, strategy, is very important, but so is the hands part over here. You have wonderful strategy, but if you can't make it work, it's not such a great strategy. So it's like an interdependent, sort of three-legged stool, how these things relate to one another. And sometimes, like the story about the blind man and the elephant, you get hold of the trunk and say, describe the elephant. Oh, the elephant is like a a long, tubular snake or something, and somebody else gets an ear and says, oh, the elephant's like that's the trouble, is getting one part and then trying to define the whole by that part. Unless we are able to grasp the whole, then we can't appreciate the value of the parts. See, and that goes to these questions of diversity as well. How do we appreciate the whole within which we can honor, respect, see value in the parts, rather than not moving to that place beyond that? I think that's one of the real challenges. But yeah, the hard work really matters.
Damon, I know this is a part of Marshall Ganz's work that you've thought a lot about and you've used, because I've been in sessions you've run. But what I'd like to ask you is do something different. Just heard Marshall's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue for me, Larry, because what I was all excited to share is that part of that understanding of the collective story is like the next step for me in my work, as it's been applied, has been the acceptance of the differences in the story and that they have meaning, if that follows, right? So in the parlance of work around cultural competency and in the IDI world, for those that know that tool, this is that there are differences and the differences matter, right? And so when we talk about organizing and creating a sort of shared narrative, the shared narrative can't just be about, okay, look, we all agree that we want X to happen, right? So let's just get on board with it, because everybody is at a different point on a continuum in terms of the power they have to offer to it, maybe the degree to which they have, understanding of an issue or a challenge. Their life experiences will definitely impact how they can show up in certain spaces. So it's not to say Marshall's construct is simplistic, because it's not. It's beautiful. It's straightforward. And it has nuance in each of those different categories. And one of those nuances that have made a huge difference in the work has been to take the sort of understanding of collective story and the differences that are inherent in it and accept, and then begin to work on how those differences make an impact on our ability to change it.
It's a little bit like in working across religious lines, where, these days you're not supposed to talk about faith at all. We're supposed to be in this secular world. Well, I think that's problematic. The other approach is to say, well, we're really all the same. Well, no, we're not. And so it calls for a strong pluralism. I mean, it's sort of like Islam has deep wisdom and content and tradition. So does Christianity, so does Buddhism, and it's honoring that without saying, well, we're all the same. No, we're not. But can we find across these valuable differences some common ground, some common understanding of our humanity that enables us to respect and build on those differences, rather than treat them as obstacles, but rather as assets. And it's easy to say the words. It is hard to do in practice. Cesar Chavez used to say, don't invite me to an ecumenical service. I'll have mass, come to my mass. You have a Seder and I'll come to your Seder. You have an Iftar and I'll come to your Iftar. It's sort of, yes, we respect, we honor the difference, but we honor our humanity too.
I want to get to some questions that have come in. Marshall, one of the questions that came in is, how do you compare the current struggles around racial equity with what you experienced in the 1960s?
Well, it's hard to compare because, I'm not the person I was in the 1960s. Well, I mean, I'm a later version, shall we say, of the same thing. And it's easy to put a gloss on history, and it's not. It's hard to compare. I think that what I'd say is this, that there are fundamental fissures in our country and in its history, and race is probably the most fundamental. And the whole project of trying to create a nation that's half slave and half free was problematic, obviously, in so many ways. So it's to be expected that that until some form of actual equality, and I'm using the word equality, not equity, because I mean equality. I mean same access to power, same access to wealth, same access to opportunity. Until we get to that kind of a place, these fissures are going to keep reopening. And it's kind of, you can look at the Civil War, you can look at the whole struggle over Reconstruction, you can look at the whole Jim Crow fights in the late 19th century, you can then look at the Civil Rights Movement. And people say, well, there hasn't been any progress. No, there's been movement forward. I think the movement has especially been when the movement has challenged the system to change. In other words, it's when the change winds up being something that we all benefit from. It's sort of, in the scripture, they talk about, that which you do for the least of these, you do for me. There's something very wise there. It's not about charity at all. It's about justice. It's about that the push, the need for change serves us all. It can, but we resist. Of course we resist. Who gives up power? I mean, that doesn't happen, And so it involves struggle and it involves conflict. And conflict aversion, frankly, is one of the things I think is most problematic that we have going on, because we then deny these conflicts we have that we need to engage with and learn from and grow from. So it's hard to compare. I mean, I know that the SNCC just had a 60th reunion about a week ago, online in DC. We know that the fights that were fought in the 60s were important fights, and they achieved gains, and they opened up things, and they developed leadership, and they developed the generations of leadership that have to do with the following generation. But we also know that this is something, there's a song Judy Collins used to sing from the 60s. Freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother, pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it, they have to fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again. I think there's a deep truth in that. There's a deep truth in that. And it's sort of, you get to this point in the mountain and then you see the next mountain. As long as you're fighting that first mountain, that's what you see. And you get there and then, okay, then it goes down maybe a bit, but then you got it, but it doesn't end. In the Jewish tradition, they talk about tikkun olam, repair of the world. And the premise is that we live in a broken world, which means that we need to take responsibility for its repair. And it isn't something that can be accomplished in 10 years or even in a lifetime, but that doesn't free us from the obligation to do it. And I think that's kind of where this is. I don't know, I hope that's helpful. I mean, yeah, this is an important fight right now. Does that mean the 60s didn't matter? No, hell no. The struggles of the 60s created a foundation.
So Marshall, first of all, I want to tell you, in the chat, there are a lot of requests for the books, and now there'll be the songs. Judy Collins is a folk musician, and we're going to try to scramble to get some of those titles up. But you've raised you've raised a number of important points, but I have to tell you, many of my students and many of the folks that I talk to when I go out to give public talk, maybe they're not the first, but eventually they'll say, thank you, but nothing changes. Nothing changes. And you've just made the comment that the work you did in the 60s mattered.
Yeah.
There's a whole generation of folks who don't see that, don't recognize that, think it's kind of a cop-out. And so I want to turn to you, Damon, because I know we've had kind of an exchange about this, about why it is that change is hard to see. Why? Because I look around the world and I have to tell you, I see it much like Marshall does. I see the battle in the 50s and 60s producing civil rights, and then how that is kind of transformed the nature of our struggles. I'd look at issues like poverty among seniors. Social Security, made huge gains in tackling that. The health reform that Barack Obama and Democrats pushed through, 30 million people now have insurance. And so I don't understand that idea, nothing changes. Can you help me?
Oh, man. I don't know that I can help, but I will offer this. For me, that nothing changes is as much about what can be seen and what can be felt. So we can see the changes that you just described. We can run down the statistics. We can, we note those moments in history where something actually did happen, right? But as we continue to live, if we don't feel that in our everyday, it can feel as if and make you determine nothing has changed. I can appreciate the both end of it, but part of that is because I too am, a lover of history, a lover of these moments, and recognize the sort of evolution of democracy, but also citizenship. However, when we still live in a place where, and I'm talking very hyper-local now, where we have some of the greatest disparities that exist in any other place than in the country is here, it can be difficult to believe that anything has changed. And so I boil it down to, if you can't feel it, it's hard to believe it. And even more so, there is a piece of this that is, I'm not going to call it short-term memory, but there is a hyper engagement in a moment. And when we're past the moment, sometimes we can lose sight of our engagement and why we were engaged. I think a lot about, like, my first couple of months post George Floyd's murder here in Minneapolis. We're talking about the racial reckoning we were going through. And I had a great conversation with Dr. Uhuru Williams over at St. Thomas about this. And we both kind of came to, it's not about the racial reckoning of this moment. It's about, let's see it in a year. Let's see in 2 years. Are people still reckoning with it in that same way? And it's because we either get exhausted and run out of gas for it, or the next thing takes our attention. It's so hard, and I think this is why Marshall's work is so important. It's not just building a movement, it's building a connection to something greater that keeps you tethered, doesn't let you get completely away from it. And so I think when people can find that connection, they have a sense that things are changing. But if they don't, and it's episodic, then it can feel like nothing's changing.
It's interesting, just to add to that. I mean, from one perspective, everything changes all the time. I mean, what is it that does not change? Things change at different paces. A stone changes over a much longer period of time than a fruit fly. But we live in a universe, in a world that is change. Now, the question is, so what do we mean when we say nothing changes? I think your point, Damon, is a very good one, is about feeling. But, there's a Yiddish riddle, who discovered water? And the answer is, I don't know, but it wasn't a fish, because we're all fish in the water of our own stories. And so, you grow up as a fish in a particular water. And so you often don't notice the water until someone says, hey, over here, water. And, oh, that's interesting. I mean, this comes with the narrative work we do a lot, where you need an interlocutor. You need someone outside the box challenging you, asking you questions so that you can begin to see the box that you're in, because it's true for all of us. And it's, it happens along all kinds of lines. And so I think, but there's also a big plus to that, because it means that not remaining satisfied. And see, not being satisfied can be a good thing, because it pushes change. It pushes things forward. And so that's not a problem. In fact, we need that to drive democracy and to drive learning, I think. So, but we don't have institutions that do the work of learning from the past so that we can act in the present to build futures with intentionality. To say nothing changes means there is no hope. And if there's no hope, well, then, yeah, let's just go to whatever, because without hope, we can't, that's why building implies a future. Structure implies a future. And, hope, just to say, it's not about flowers in May. Maimonides had a definition of hope, which was that it's belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. In other words, to be a realist is to recognize it is always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. It was utterly improbable we would elect a Black man president of this country in 2007, and it happened. It's that place between fantasy and certainty where imagination, where hope, and where possibility live. And if we let go of that, then we're done. Then we're done.
Marshall, I think you've put your finger on exactly the issue, because when I hear nothing changes, I hear no hope.
No.
And I think the argument you've made, Damon's comments, point to why that is, that kind of fatalism plays into the very structures of inequality that you've been railing against all these years. Let me shift gears a little bit. Marshall, you've been working clearly on the left for 60 years now. And clearly the tools of organizing that you've used and mastered are being used by conservatives. They're being used by religious groups that may have values different from your own. They're even being used by militias, including those who were active on January 6th. Now, all of this is not new in America. James Madison, after the Declaration, talked about the nightmare that was emerging in America because of the deep engagement of citizens who were taking seriously the Declaration, who took seriously the promise of equality in a democratic society. And that was when Madison, really engineered the Constitution and the framework of creating filters, of creating, elites who would refine and / ignore some of the popular views. So my question to you is, does it worry you to see the tools that you've been developing and using all these years being used in the hands of people who fundamentally disagree with some of your values?
Well, not so much. I mean, because it has to do with we're human beings, and much changes. But we have our fears, we have our hopes, we have our loves, we have our families, we don't. And there's some pretty basic kind of stuff there. And so the basic tools, things like relationship building, storytelling, strategizing. I mean, that didn't just get invented. I mean, that's been around for, I love the Moses stories. I mean, I think of the conversation of Moses and God at the burning bush is the first time we heard about self-us now. When God calls him, and the first thing he said, hey, the wrong guy, not me. And then he says, wait a second, who are you and these people? And can't this wait? And so the negotiations begin. I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of the tools we work with are embedded in our humanity. We all tell stories, we all form relationships, we all strategize every time we're late for the bus. We all take action, and we all create structures with each other. So now, how do we go about doing those things? We have different technologies, different ways we can do it. And I think, so, but I guess the other thing I want to say, Larry, is that, we have never had a representative democracy in this country. And it's getting less representative every day because the divergence between who the people are and where the people are and the numbers of people is so at variance with our structures of representation, the Senate, the first by the post districts, the whole presidential system for that matter, that builds in profound political inequalities. Now that is a problem. And it's a constitutional problem. It's a deep structural problem. And when you put that in relationship to the role of money now, it's tough. So how to break through that then becomes, I think, just.
But Marshall, let me come back to what was the intent of my question, which is in advocating for extra constitutional, outside the usual bounds of kind of organized politics, institutional politics.
Yeah, yeah.
In arguing for that sort of engagement by citizens, don't you open the door to, the kind of activities, the most extreme form being the militias that have been organizing in states that have been, engaged in the attack on our Capitol on January 6th? Isn't that a dangerous path?
That's why we have to be better at it. That's why we have to be better at it. In other words, I think it was sort of popular in the Democratic world to just, let's talk about policy. They're talking about, those, all that emotional talk over there. That's not what we do. Well, better learn to talk emotion. I mean, the language of emotion is one of the fundamental languages we speak as human beings. It's a language we speak in music and drama and worship, and it's how we communicate deep meaning. Now, if we think we can just replace that with the cost-benefit analysis, we're missing the point. And so, I think that sometimes those who organize or mobilize around fear, as opposed to hope, who mobilize around exclusion as opposed to inclusion. See, there's a deep asymmetry here too. If you're organizing around homogeneity, we like everyone who's just like us, right? It's a different challenge than, we like everybody who's not like us. There's an asymmetry between the value of difference. I think I have to put it in terms of pro-democratic people, thinkers, and those who don't. And so we have more work to do. It's harder. But look, you can look at Trump. I mean, Trump was mobilizing around fear. Now, look at Obama's talks from 2007-8. He was mobilizing around hope. The thing is, we got to be better at the hope than the fear. We got to be better at the solidarity than the isolation. It's not so. It's about mastering these tools of how people organize and mobilize. And yeah, I don't know how to say it. It's of course they do it.
We're coming close to the end of our time together, so I want to get a few more questions here. Damon, you worked for a number of years in the nonprofit sector. Here's a question that's really directed at you. It seems that the structure of nonprofit organization can work against organizing for power. That is, working to raise a budget to support a staff and an office can inhibit confronting powerful institutions that are sources of money for the nonprofits. Can you help us with that?
100% correct. It's well stated. And actually, I feel like for a long time, I sat sort of in the belly of that beast, but at an interesting intersection where it was very externally facing with community and organizers, yet we were, perpetrators, if you will, of some of those same embedded structures. It is something that I think we need to grapple with really in a pointed way. The nonprofit structure, and I'll be honest, I think the sort of positioning or orientation of nonprofits in heart is really necessary. It provides not just service to community, but an avenue for folks in community to do some of their most meaningful work. That said, the model by which we go about funding those efforts is at the very least problematic. I actually think Marshall did a great job of speaking to it in some ways in a recent article where he talked about, sort of like having this idea of nonprofits work much like private wealth does, right? And so they are a different conduit for private wealth to insert itself into some of these very public spaces. While that's been useful because some people's orientation that have private wealth is about the greater good, so they're spending their money that way, there's still the limitation of, well, what if you do something that they don't prefer in terms of how their money is spent? They can move it someplace else. It's extremely problematic. But the one thing that I will say is that I feel locally like we have gotten much better about naming it as a problem. And it's sort of like all the steps, that go into a recovery process. First, you've got to name that there's a problem, and then you can start to address how to get after it. And one of the ways that I think we've been getting after it locally is to number one, to get to philanthropy a little bit and ask them to start being different about how they share money, are transparent about how it is they allocate their resources, and then limiting the number of structural hoops they make people jump through to access them. And then I think that the interesting thing that actually relates to mobilization is that we are doing a better job of mobilizing people to share their resources with us without it having to be huge contributions and only through a couple of avenues. There's lots of ways to do it now that I think nonprofits are tapping into and will be necessary. The last thing I'll say around this idea that nonprofits really just replicate for-profit structures is accurate and is another thing that I think we'll need to address. And by that, I mean, tapping into more shared leadership models, dispersing power within organizations in ways that replicate how communities often organize, I think will serve the nonprofit community significantly moving forward.
Marshall, you've talked about the risk of organizations placing their existence in the hands of funders rather than in the hands of well-organized constituencies.
Exactly.
What's the problem? What's the problem that you see?
Well, Sid Verba once said the test of liberal democracy was an experiment to see whether equality of voice could balance inequality of wealth or resources. Yeah. And it's not going so well. I mean, because the way, as a mechanism for that balance, is collective action, is organization. Now, the question is, in an organization, is where does the authority come from? Does it flow from members or from citizens up, or does it flow from the top down? Firms and NGOs are structured such that it flows from the top down. There's boards, donors, so forth, and then it goes down and they serve whom they serve and they do what they do. Unions are one of the few organizations that's still there where it actually does flow from the bottom up. Now there's struggles there because you can get into oligarchic issues and so forth, but basically the power depends on the people. It depends on having an organized base among people. Now, if your power depends on what's given you, as opposed to what you owe to those who chose you, it's a very different dynamic. It creates a dependency. And this is not to say about bad people or anything, but it builds a dependency into the system that the inequality in wealth and all its economic and political consequences, then we have an explosion in philanthropy as a part of that explosion of wealth that then comes in and becomes the source also theoretically of challenging that. Does that work? I think, most social movements wind up capitalizing with their own labor to begin with. I mean, we didn't get salaries in the farm workers for a long time. And this is a big question, but I think it comes back to the question of power. Who actually holds the resources from which power is built?
Marshall, I'm going to have to cut you off there. We've run out of time. I just want to mention one last audience question, and this is it. Quote, Marshall is amazing. Why am I just hearing about his wisdom now? So I'll let you think about why that's happening. You'll have to come back. You'll have to come back and join us again.
Yeah. Thanks, Larry. I haven't been on it long.
I want to thank Marshall Ganz, who is truly an icon in the world of community organizing. There are many conservatives who have read and talked about Marshall's work, as well as obviously progressives. Damon Shoholm, thank you so much for joining us. If you don't know Damon, you should. He is a powerhouse in the world of nonprofits and community. And if you can go to some of the works that he's doing in facilitating conversations across difference, I recommend it. I've done it. I've gained a lot from it. Let me just quickly run through some final announcements. We've got already several programs coming up next couple of weeks. Health reform is alive and well. And we're going to talk about it with some important, informed Washington, D.C. insiders who who are carefully studying what's going on at this moment, literally in Washington, as they're looking at some very significant reforms. That's Wednesday, November 17th, noon Central Time. And then we got a program coming up November 19th, noon Central, for Biden Failures and Option. This includes the former editor of the National Review, Rich Lowry, and Republican Vin Weber. They'll both be here for that. And we've got a bunch of programs coming up after that. I do want to mention, if you've enjoyed this program or want to share it, it will be posted in about a day or two on YouTube and podcasts. And actually, you can sign up for our podcast, and then you won't have to worry about tracking it down. It's all of your favorite social media outlets. It's under Dialogue Across Difference. Finally, I want to just let you know that our events, of course, are free and open to the public, but they do take resources. If you're interested in joining our donor circle, we would welcome that. Here's some information on that. We are also going to be focusing on one of our really important programs started by Walter Mondale over 30 years ago, called the Policy Fellows. Damon is a graduate of the Policy Fellows. It includes business, nonprofits, government, Republicans, Democrats, and lots of positions inside, military, rural folks. It's really an amazing group of people and leaders in our community. It's well worth supporting, so consider that as well. Finally, I want to thank you all for joining us. It's been great having you here, and what a terrific conversation. Once again, thank you, Marshall Ganz and Damon Shoholm. Thank you.